Hello everybody, me again for the second time. In the first presentation I talked a little bit about the history of interpreting from 1625 and just picked a few examples that I thought may be of interest. Now I'm interested in looking at the changing face of interpreting and some of the professional developments that we've seen in recent years. If we accept that formal training was established in the 1930s, then we've seen some changes and some developments. I mean, one of the most well-known developments and often is used as a role model is the registration of interpreters for the deaf in America, the United States, known as the RID. It was established by people who were of deaf parents, coders, and we know that they've had a historic role in the community. In 1964 they came together and formed RID. At that time they were wanting to ensure that sign language interpreting was professionalised, that people adhered to a code of ethics, and that they were respectful of both their hearing and deaf clients or consumers or service users. And then they developed a test to assess whether interpreters were competent enough to work as interpreters, and that then included some codes of ethics to see whether interpreters would follow the appropriate professional behaviours. We also know 50 years ago in Sweden they established STTF, that's celebrating its 50th year this year. In 1972, 1973 in Sweden, sign language was accepted as a language within the education system. That meant that if parents gave birth to a deaf child, they had the right to learn sign language, but also that some children would be put in mainstream settings and they needed to grow the number of interpreters. So that's a very different system in Sweden compared to our American colleagues. And we see in the Nordic countries, Sweden and Denmark, often interpreter training is related to the number of deaf children who need to be educated. In the UK, in 1928, we know that the Deaf Welfare Examination Board, DWEB, there were many people who were born into deaf families who became missioners. Here's an example of Leslie Edwards presenting, although he was a deaf missioner. So they were in the DWEB, that's the sign, and they would engage in that education and then be assessed. So we saw a variety of different developments. But in the 1960s, we really started to see that the interpreting profession was seen as a separate profession. We weren't there to support or advocate for deaf people, and we weren't there as missionaries or welfare workers. We saw that development in America and in Sweden, and then latterly in the UK, and maybe in the 1980s, we started to see that development where we had tests to assess whether interpreters were good or not. In Sweden, they engaged in training either in the folk high schools or the universities, and we know, of course, in Russia in the 1930s, we had that kind of college level education as well, which has now developed into 3 or 4 years of training. Once you've graduated from those training programs, you can then work as an interpreter. But we've seen that the world has changed and gradually training has become more rigorous. As you know, WASLI, the World Association of Sign Language Interpreters, is in existence. We also have EFSLI, the European Forum of Sign Language Interpreters, covering the Council of Europe area. It has 38 members, and WASLI has many members globally. And we have the establishment of national interpreter associations in Ireland, the UK, Scotland, Finland, and across the whole of Europe. Moscow too. And we've seen a change from the traditional link that we saw to the deaf community and of people, family members working as interpreters. Also changes from deaf associations, often starting to develop professionally. Historically, we have often seen interpreter associations have developed within the deaf community, and then when they've gained strength, they've become independent organisations. Often that's also enabled deaf people to have better access to society, and that's what's enabled those kind of political changes. But we've seen good collaboration and cooperation between deaf associations and interpreter associations. We see this cooperative agreement between the World Federation of the Deaf and WASLI, where we have a clear understanding of what is the purview of deaf associations to lobby government, for example, and for sign language rights, and for interpreting associations to lobby for working conditions and other things. Sometimes, of course, there's overlap. If we think about sign language, we know that that is the purview of deaf associations, but that doesn't mean that they can't be supported by interpreter associations. And we see these cooperations happening. I mean, one example, if we consider America and the RID, when they were established, there was a strong cooperation between RID and the National Association of the Deaf, the NAD. We then kind of saw them being slightly less cooperative. RID established an interpreter assessment. NAD weren't necessarily happy with that, and so they established their own interpreting assessment. So we saw a parting of ways in some way. Then we saw after several years, there was greater collaboration between the two organisations, and they developed a new test together. At the moment, it seems that they may be drifting apart again. It's not clear whether interpreters are heading in one direction and their interpreter association and the Deaf Association is wanting to head in a different direction. Obviously, WASLI would like to see strong collaboration between interpreter associations and deaf associations. A few years ago, I undertook some research to see what deaf people felt of these changes, and one of the participants in that research said, of course, deaf people want to have better access, and so they need to have more interpreters, and that you couldn't necessarily rely on the people who grew up within the community. But they still wanted to ensure that hearing people mixed enough. They felt that interpreters just dipped in and out of the community, and they needed to make sure that they were deeply involved in the community, and that was less common nowadays. One participant also said, we have different experiences. I'm born deaf. It's like if you imagine I was born in Mars and hearing people are born in Earth, and they're different. If you grew up in Earth and then you went to Mars, and then you saw what Mars was like, and you came back to Earth and you told people about Mars, that's different from if somebody from Mars came to Earth and described Mars. They're just different experiences. So being an insider in the community and an outsider in the community is different. So professional interpreters need to think about how they engage with the community appropriately. And here's that quote. Also in that research, here within the UK, we've seen that the system of interpreting has changed and how we assess interpreters. Initially, the British Deaf Association led that initiative, that project. Then in 1982, we established our assessment body. The Professional Association actually was established after that period in 1987. We have always had good relations with the British Deaf Association, and both organisations have had representation on the board of the interpreting assessment body. So we have always had quite good collaborative working, and although we may take slightly different positions, generally we seem to have closer workings than other places. Both organisations are able to feed back into changes for assessments and also to make sure that the level of assessment improves and we get better interpreters who are fit for purpose. So generally we work well together. Even so, there's been a shift. Historically, deaf people would have asked people who were in their community. They may have had a short training course, and they would have still been known to the community. Now, interpreters come who deaf people may not know. And the whole process has changed, and it's important that those interpreters are able to undertake some self-reflection. It's about the power dynamics that we see in those situations. In the past, deaf people had some choice over who they asked to come and interpret for them in some contexts globally. But now, professional interpreters need to consider how they engage in that process. We know that the view is that historically interpreters mixed with the community, and now there are definitely within my research some people who felt that interpreters wore the professional label of being an interpreter in a way which distanced them from the community. They saw themselves as professional, and they no longer allied themselves with the professional. So that's something that we've also seen in terms of deaf people's views. And here's another quote from one of the people in my research, saying that interpreting dominates everything rather than people being sensitive to community needs. We also know that we now have the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disability. In the UK, as we are a signatory, I was interested in what the profession thought of the word professional, because it's mentioned explicitly within the convention. And I found 3 things which were relevant according to interpreting professionals. They wanted the person to have passed whatever the national assessment was, and to have their name on the list of accredited interpreters or the register. In some countries that meant, of course, passing their university courses and graduating from the university course, and then their name being entered onto the register. In other places that means going for a test, and if you pass that assessment, then your name is on the register as a professional interpreter. So it's some kind of screening. Secondly, that as a professional interpreter, you should be able to observe that in the behaviours of those interpreters. That you see some professional behaviour, they're well dressed, they are trustworthy, honest, and behave with integrity. And it could be, of course, that means in informal moments they're able to engage with the communities appropriately, but when they're undertaking the language work of interpreters, they do that without expressing an opinion or by being faithful to the message. And then the third issue that people said they wanted to see was that interpreters continued to develop and engaged in growth. So after they'd engaged in the training course that they did, or graduated from the university course and passed an appropriate assessment, then whilst working, the danger was that their skills would decrease, or they would maintain their level of skills but not be aware of new information or new developments. What people wanted to see was that interpreters continue to engage in the profession. And of course we have a wonderful example today. You've all come here to this conference to listen to ideas. In the UK we would call that CPD, Continual Professional Development. And we see globally that's more of an emerging thing. People want to see people maintaining their language skills by mixing in the communities, sign language and spoken language. And also potentially if you work within an area, I don't know, and you're wanting to change, if you work in the area of employment and you're wanting to learn more about working within the area of legal interpreting, you could go on to a course like the Justice Signs information and find out more information about how to work in that environment. You could observe interpreters. You could engage in supervision to improve your skills. There are a variety of different activities we can engage in to maintain our skills and improve our skills. One of the other things is, of course, research, and we've seen the research into sign language interpreting develop exponentially in recent years. I engaged in a 2-year interpreter training program from 1995 to 1997 at Bristol University. So I've been working for the last 21 years as an interpreter as well as an interpreter trainer. And at that point, there wasn't that much research into sign languages, just perhaps Dennis Coakley, who did research into sign language interpreting. Also, Dr. Cynthia Roy, who was based at Gallaudet University for many years. And just fewer examples, Dr. Deborah Russell, who is our esteemed president of WASLI, Jemina Napier, Professor Jemina Napier, who I'm sure many of you know. So we've seen the number of interpreting research increase, my own research, and it's really increased tremendously. Some people focus on the cognitive processes, some people focus on the language that we use, some people think about the turn taking that happens and how we manage those moments. My own research looks at deaf translators and interpreters who work in television. This is my book. And so we see an ever increasing area of research. There's lots of information out there. And one of the things that we can do to maintain our skills is to read this research so we know about settings before we go into them. And my research definitely saw that if we're wanting to be professional interpreters, we have to engage in professional development. We also see other changes in work patterns and professionalisation. We know that now you need to pass some kind of assessment normally, or there are a variety of different systems. You need to be aware of the systems you're working in. If you go to court, then you need to know what the expectations of the legal system are of you, what laws they have for you, what role they perceive you to have in that place, how you're supposed to engage with those people. Here is Dr. Deborah Russell's research. And so she found very clearly, the president of WASLI, that when interpreting in court, it was better often to use a consecutive interpreting approach rather than a simultaneous approach in terms of better levels of accuracy, which could involve note-taking. So that's a very important finding. By knowing that research, we can have conversations with court officials to try and change the way that we work to better do the job. For television interpreting, if I think of my own research, I explored how deaf people interpreted to their communities. They talked about growing up in the community, thinking about how information traditionally would have been delivered to the community, and emulating that when they worked on television. So again, by reading the research, but the research showed that they engaged in very specific preparation activities, looking at the videos and changing their product. So again, if we're thinking about television interpreting work, we can use deaf interpreters as role models to better support the work that we do and therefore create better access to the deaf communities whom we serve. If we think about Professor Napier's work, she's looked at interpreting within university settings and the types of conscious strategies that we engage in, conscious omissions. We may remove repetitions or we may move information from one place to another, but also we have some kind of unintentional omissions as well. And by reading that work, we're better able to understand how we approach the work that we do. And research can tell us these things. By being involved in professional development, we're better able to support the work that we do, support each other, also engage in discussions with governments, and WASLI would strongly engage you to be involved in professional development in your regions. We know in Russia there are many different situations. It may be that Moscow, the dialect of Moscow Russian Sign Language is different from other places. Perhaps you use more finger spelling than other places, and it's good to be aware of that. If somebody moves from another place into Moscow, then you need to be sensitive to those situations. We know that there is a corpus of Russian Sign Language So that's cutting edge research looking at the structure of Russian Sign Language, undertaken by Dr. Vadim Kimmelman. It's very impressive research. We know it tells us more about the structure of Russian Sign Language, the types of variation we see in Russian Sign Language. That can help us to develop our skills and be more sensitive to the language that's used in the deaf community. As interpreters, you may have worked in areas and you have a substantial body of knowledge. The question is, how do you pass that on to your colleagues? Do you give workshops? How do you ensure that people learn from your experiences? You could mentor a newer interpreter and support them in those work moments and guide them on a good path. It could be that you know more about how to interpret in the legal system or in the police. And again, you can pass that information on to your colleagues and have better discussions with the legal system to improve the way you interpret in those areas. Moving on to continuing professional development within the UK, it's a strong premise. And we can engage in filming our own work and then reviewing our work and seeing how our works can be improved, getting feedback from colleagues, getting feedback from members of the deaf community, seeing how we can do the job better and improve our skills. We can have professional practice groups where we discuss the work that we do, professional supervision. That's one of the things that we've definitely seen as a change in more recent years. It may have been that people grew up in the community and didn't have much training, and they were known to the community, as I've said in the past. Now we see people are trained much more extensively. They may know some of the people they work with, but not all of the people they work with. And historically, it may have been that you didn't earn so much. Now we have better wages. It may be that we have agencies who organise our work in different ways, different companies. Even so, we can still work in collaboration with communities and engage in continual professional development. Once you've passed your assessment, it's not an excuse to rest on your laurels. In some countries, you do 10 hours. In the UK, we have to do 24 hours of continuing professional development every year to ensure we maintain and improve our skills. It could be reading things, and we document that. In America, over 4 years, you must do 80 hours of continuing professional development, and this is what that looks like in their system. So it could be that you do 20 hours a year or you do more hours in 1 year, as long as you get to 80 hours overall. And in WASLI, the WASLI and WFD have an accreditation for international sign interpreters, and again you have to ensure that you do professional development on a yearly basis and document that. So that's also a significant change that we see globally. A commitment to continuing professional development, greater awareness of our languages, greater collaboration with deaf people, and much more strategic thinking about how we develop in our careers. I think we've got a very bright future ahead of us, but we're the ones who need to make sure we achieve it. I'm hoping that some of the ideas that I've shared with you are food for thought, and you can reflect upon how you can improve your own skills and potentially work together in groups. Who knows, maybe this conference will be the beginning of a series of conferences and there'll be more people coming to Moscow to discuss your work. And Russia can really begin to be a role model for the rest of the world to talk about linguistics, or to share. Anna Kolmarova can share her knowledge, or many people can share their knowledge about their work, and the world can begin to look up to see the stuff that you do. Thank you very much for your attention.